Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Okay, so this episode actually introduces us to the to the next member of the boss's special unit, specifically his stand, and I'll get to that in a minute. But in case the episode actually picks up immediately where the last one left off, where they've since fled Venice, pretty sure that none of the special unit is going to be remaining in Venice, and immediately go to the international airport nearby to get ready to take a plane to Sardinia, and so that they can learn the boss's identity and pass as soon as possible, so that they can assassinate him. But the reason they decide to go for a plane in this episode is that according to Bruno, the plane is going to be moving very quickly and is going to be very high up in the air, which means it'll be out of the range of potentially any stand user for about 2 hours. So, for the time being, they can just take that moment of reprieve to try and maybe relax a little bit. And sure enough, they started, and sure enough, the first thing they do is have Giorno use gold experience to assess if there's any life on the plane, and after using gold experience to test for all life within a certain radius, he does eventually conclude that there is nothing on the plane, and that the only people that should be there are the team Bucciarati. At which point, Bucciarati then immediately gets prepped to get ready to go and get on the plane, and the first thing they do when they get on is that Abbacchio actually uses Moody Blues to create a pilot so that he can actually drive the plane that way. And when Narancia kind of questions him a little bit, pointing out that there's no guarantee that the guy who drove it last actually went to Sardinia, but Abbacchio merely points out that all he has to do is find the IATA code for Sardinia, pointing out that the plane will most likely fly itself once they've done that point, and for the time being, all he has to do is just punch it in, and they'll be good to go. And Narancia's immediately pretty impressed with the fact that Abbacchio actually knows how to do that, and asks him how he learned about IATA codes and how they work. But that confidence kind of goes out the window when it's learned that Abbacchio kind of learns that from a movie, and it's not entirely clear if that can actually be applied to real life. Which does admittedly cause Narancia to become a little bit more skeptical about Abbacchio's piloting skills. At which point Bruno and some of the other members walk in. And Bruno asks Abbacchio how long it's going to take, and Abbacchio points out that he has to it might take a while for him to rewind to a point, and that could take a couple of minutes before he actually finds what he's looking for. And during this exchange, Trish actually sits down in the cabin, and also notes that and she herself actually finally clues into Bruno's odd condition that he's been having for the past couple of episodes now. Which she notices that he has a pretty deep cut on his leg, yet doesn't seem to be bleeding at all. And she surmises that it was most likely from the recent attack at the restaurant, but she decides to let it go because she has no idea what's going on with Bruno either. So that's two members of the team that are now aware of what's going on with Bruno and are aware that something strange is going on with him. Considering the fact that he has a very deep gash in his leg, isn't bleeding all that much, and doesn't even seem to notice that he has a gash in his leg. But in any case, with that, they then continue to get ready to settle in and get ready to take off, and Bruno actually has Giorno and Mista stand guard outside and also Narancia as well, to just make sure that nobody actually comes onto the plane and keep anybody from coming on and surprising them. And sure enough, as they predicted, they're kind of bored at this point. But as they kind of predicted, they note that a very strange individual whose name isn't mentioned in the episode, but his name is Carne. But in case they see a man named Carne walking up to the plane, and And then Misa pulls out his revolver and tells the man to stop moving and coming forward, pointing out that nobody is to board the plane, and proceeds to point out that nobody else is supposed to board the plane, and that if he comes any closer, he will be shot, even if he's a saint. But the man doesn't listen, and Misa then adds the fact that a saint likely wouldn't be anywhere near an airfield, and then issues one last warning. And when Carne actually doesn't listen, Misa then proceeds to shoot him in the leg, which causes him to take a knee for a brief moment, and tells him to turn around if he doesn't want to get shot again. But Carne is still very much determined to actually board the plane, and then reveals that he is indeed a stand user and summons his stand, albeit briefly. We don't really get a great glimpse of it. And there's a very good narrative reason for that. We don't really get a good glimpse of Carne's stand because immediately after he summons it, Misa immediately shoots him with his gun, and he doesn't even use Sex Pistols to fight back. He just immediately defeats him, and the man collapses and dies. And of course, Misa concludes that he must not have been very tough, but Giorno also points out that seemed a little too easy, since usually the stand users that they fought give up a bit more of a fight than that. And sure enough, goes to check his pulse to see if he's actually dead, and also uses gold experience to do so as well. And Misa kind of gets a little bit offended by the fact that Giorno doesn't think very highly of him, if he's thinking that it was a little too easy. And just concludes that if the guy wasn't able to stand much of a chance against Mista, then obviously it doesn't really matter all that much. But of course, Giorno, after touching Carne's lifeless body and concluding that he is indeed dead, decides for the time being that's probably nothing, and then they proceed to board the plane. At which point, everybody kind of just settles in and gets ready to go on board for the long ride that they're going to need to take to Sardinia. At which point, Trish and Bruno have a bit of a sit down and have a bit of a heart to heart. With Bruno pointing out that they'll be in Sardinia within a couple hours, and it's at this point where. Trish then proceeds to wonder what her father and former boss and their boss would think of her now if they knew they were going to Sardinia. After correcting her, pointing out that it's her former boss, he then proceeds to point out that the boss is a very secretive person and likely wouldn't have and is very annoyed about the fact that people are trying to look into his past, and points out that he's a very powerful and very dangerous gangster, and that he likely keeps his past a secret on purpose to kind of keep any potential enemies away. But also points out that that's exactly why they need to know more information. And even points out to Trish that since she's the last his last remaining relative, she must have some sort of information that the boss doesn't want to get leaking out. And asked her if there's anything she remembers from her childhood, anything at all that her mother told her, any stories, anything like that could point them to the boss's real identity, that she shouldn't be afraid to speak up because they're all in this together. At which point, Trish then decides to actually conclude that there was indeed a moment where her mother actually did meet the boss well before he was a gangster, pointing out that she actually met him in a hotel in the Golden Coast, and tells him that they actually did meet in Sardinia, and her mother knew for a fact that the man was a native Sardinian, so she knows based on his accent, so she knows that he was from around the area. And after a few days, the two they kind of dated, had a kid, and then he presumably became a gangster, and they never heard from him again. So with Bruno concluding that is likely the best place to actually go and look, and concludes that when they land, that'll be the first place they investigate. And meanwhile, Giorno and Mista are kind of just chilling out in the cabin when Giorno suddenly hears a very strange noise coming from the refrigerator, and Giorno, noting that there shouldn't be anybody on board the plane, then proceeds to kind of gets a little bit paranoid because he heard a very strange noise that he likely shouldn't have been hearing, and immediately tells Misa to ready his guns and tells him that he heard something strange. But Misa is very unconvinced about the fact that Giorno has heard something, pointing out that they took care of the guy that was supposed to attack them, and there's really no reason for them to actually go and investigate. But Giorno then proceeds to insist, pointing out that obviously he doesn't feel very safe right now, and points out that there is a very good chance that it's his imagination, but on the off chance it isn't, he wants Misa to be there to have his back. And Misa, understanding that it could possibly be nothing, but also pointing out that it could be something because he trusts Giorno to know, but proceeds to pull out his gun and does what he's asked, and aims at the fridge as Giorno's opening it. And sure enough, when they open it, they discover an ice cube tray, and they note that it just filled itself up. And Giorno then proceeds to apologize to Misa, worrying him over nothing, pointing out that it was likely the ice cubes that were making the sound he heard, and that he was being paranoid over nothing. But then Misa actually noticed something that looks like chicken bones sitting in the bottom of the refrigerator, and asked Giorno if he was the one who put them there. And then Giorno turns around very confused about what Misa just said. And sure enough, when they look inside, they look closely, and they do see bones, but upon closer inspection, they realize that it's actually fingers. Which of course causes Misa and Giorno to begin freaking out by pointing out that obviously that those finger bones shouldn't be there, like, at all. Those severed fingers should not be there. And Misa becomes a little bit paranoid, pointing out that obviously somebody put them there, but he also pointed out that Giorno should know that there's no life on the plane, and Giorno does indeed conclude that there shouldn't be. And eventually their paranoia does attract the rest of the group, who notice that Giorno and Mista are acting strangely and confessing it. And when Bruno comes over to investigate, and they prompt him to come over and see what they found, Bruno is understandably even more confused as to what's going on, because as he points out, Giorno checked to see if there was any life on the plane, and of course he did very much check, and concerned over whether or not the fingers mean anything, he then asks Giorno to check them for signs of life, which Giorno does using his gold experience, and it does indeed conclude that there is no sign of life, because by Giorno's own explanation, he tests this by growing grass in the refrigerator, and explains that his powers don't work on things that are, well, alive. So if they're things that were already alive, his gold experience can't transform them into life. They have to be either dead or inanimate for his abilities to work. But so the fact that they're lifeless fingers does kind of console the group a little bit, but they also point out that it's very strange that they're there, and are very worried that there might be an enemy on board. So to ensure the group's safety, Bruno then concludes that they should eject the refrigerator from the plane, which Narancia openly objects to, pointing out that they're currently moving very fast, and also the fact that opening the plane will actually destabilize air pressure within the cabin and cause a whole mess of problems, and it'll be sucked out like a toilet. But Bruno, realizing that he needs to do something, then proceeds to summon his sticky fingers and make a small enough hole in the plane that it won't cause problems, but big enough that the refrigerator will just fall right through. And sure enough, he opens the zipper and it falls right out. And then points out that they were worried over nothing, and has since assured that the group is now safe. At which point, everybody goes back to what they were doing and goes to go sit down. So Giorno proceeds to return to his chair, kind of still confused about what he saw. But then he notes somebody has written in Italian that they would like some pizza, and Giorno just kind of chuckles to himself, pointing out that actually sounds pretty good, and concludes that when this is all over, he'll have to get a pizza or something. They'll have to get a pizza or something for old time's sake. But then he notes that there's a lot more scribbling on the wall, and which causes Giorno to become even more confused and a little bit scared, because, as he points out, there should be writing. The fact that there's so much writing on the wall is a little concerning, considering they're in a private plane. also proceeds to point out that they're not to put that obviously that it feels like the inside of a bathroom. If you've seen the inside of a bathroom, you know that everybody likes to write their thoughts and chicken scratch all over the walls of the stalls. You know what I'm talking about if you've ever been to a public bathroom. You know exactly what I'm talking about. But eventually, Giorno then becomes a little disturbed when he discovers a very strange message written on the wall. And upon closer inspection, discovers that it's actually a warning from an enemy stand explaining how it works. And sure enough, he becomes very confused when somehow it leaves a message about the fact that there is a stand called Notorious B.I.G. or B.I.G. It's not explained because that's how they pronounce it in the show. But Notorious, but in any case, it's the stand Notorious B.I.G. has somehow boarded onto the plane, and Giorno becomes very confused since he has no idea where the stand actually is, but then proceeds to notice something strange is going on with his arm, and sure enough, upon reeling up his sleeve, he discovers a strange blob-like substance attached to his arm, kind of like a blob of flesh, complete with that's currently holding a pen, and Giorno is very confused and a little bit scared, pointing out that that shouldn't be there. He notes that it's a very strange thing, and starts kind of making a bit of a commotion, pointing out that this must be Notorious B.I.G. and notes that it must be Carne's stand. But he also points out that should be impossible since Carne is very much deceased, and starts realizing that this must be the ability that Carne actually was trying to do, and finally realizes why it was so easy to take him down, because as it turns out, Carne's stand didn't fully materialize until he was dead, and when Giorno touched him, the stand then moved from Carne to Giorno and started growing a mass from his arm. And this causes Giorno to freak out, and eventually the rest of the group then proceeds to notice that there is indeed something wrong with Giorno growing from his arm, and Giorno immediately tries to fight back against the stand to try and get it away from him, pulling out a knife from the kitchen on board their plane and trying to cut the stand free from his arm, but that only causes the stand to become aggressive and proceeds to attack the knife and send it flying, and it almost impales Trish in the process, who is watching the whole thing but isn't entirely sure what to do, and she very nearly gets hit by a knife. But in any case, Giorno then proceeds to try and fight back against the stand, only to discover, much to his horror, that not only is the stand consuming his arm, but it's consuming his stand's arm as well, and he's not going to, and he quickly realizes that the stand is slowly consuming his energy, and it's only a matter of time before it consumes his whole arm. And of course, Mista, quickly realizing that Giorno is fighting an uphill battle and is never going to win the fight with the stand on his arm, quickly pulls out his stand and gun and uses Sex Pistols to then proceed to cut off Giorno's arm, and tells him that he better start making a replacement arm ASAP because he's going to need one. And of course, Giorno is still very confused about the fact there's an enemy stand. At which point, Bruno then proceeds to wonder whether or not there's a stand user hiding nearby, and proceeds to ask Giorno how he thinks the stand is being controlled. At which point, Giorno then proceeds to tell him exactly what he knows. He points out that the stand user is dead, and the fact that Notorious B.I.G. is just able to manifest itself without a stand user is a very dangerous thing. Concluding that, according to himself, this stand breaks every rule in the book, and he is indeed very much right. It's not only does it have a physical form, which is something most stands don't do, but it also doesn't have a stand user, which most stands don't do. And then on top of that, it's able to eliminate it, and it kind of sends Carne into a suicide mission where his whole main purpose is to kill himself, so that his stand has no potential weakness. And of course, this quickly makes Bruno realize that they'll need to find a way to get rid of the stand. But Narancia points out that it isn't even moving, and concludes that it likely isn't that fast or that tough if it isn't even trying to fight them. But but it's at this point where Misa reveals that actually the reason it's not moving is because it's currently feeding. And sure enough, it's not only snacking on Giorno's arm and to create more of itself, but according to me, but apparently it also got several of Mista's sex pistols and has consumed more than enough of them that it's causing Mista to suddenly to kind of bleed out a little bit and take physical damage, because that's how colony stands are established to work. If you have, I mean, obviously if you attack the stand, it causes an equal amount of physical harm on the user, but colony stands are mostly immune to this phenomenon unless you attack most of them. Which is a lot more dangerous in Misa's case because he only has 6. So, and of course, because he has the majority of his stands are lost, Misa then proceeds to start bleeding and fall unconscious. At which point Narancia concludes that he'll need to fight back against the stand himself, and pointing out that it'll most likely be fine if he doesn't actually wind up getting attacked touching it. He then proceeds to summon out his Aerosmith so they can fight back, only for the stand to immediately leap at Narancia's Aerosmith and attack it, and cripple Narancia as well, because now Narancia is very much injured. At which point Bruno quickly realizing that there's something wrong, and Giorno realizing that it's actually switching targets a little too quickly. The two have no idea how to actually fight back against the stand yet, so they tell Trish to flee, only for the stand to suddenly change targets again, stop attacking Aerosmith, and go after Trish. And it's at this point where Giorno has finally figured out how the stand is actually picking which targets to attack, and then proceeds to start punching one of the windows on the plane, which once again attacks the attentions of Notorious B.I.G, and it attacks him again. Finally, Giorno reveals that the reason the stand is attacking targets seemingly at random is because it's prioritizing the people who are moving the quickest. And currently that's Giorno's arm. So he realized that there's going to likely need to be another way to actually get rid of the stand. And sure enough, he concludes that the only real thing to do is to cut off his own arm and eject it from the plane. Using the broken glass from the window, might I add. But, which, of course, Bruno openly objects to, pointing out that, that's a way too dangerous and way too risky maneuver for reasons that we actually do find out later, and, tells Giorno to actually let him sacrifice an arm instead, since, he still has both of them. But to this point, but Giorno pointing out that'll likely be too late, and it's already consuming his arm, does ultimately decide to cut off his own arm, and in the process actually winds up dropping one of his brooches, and this actually causes Notorious B.I.G to go flying out of the plane. At which point Giorno winds up collapsing because of the fact that he's bleeding out of both of his arms, and it's at this point where Bruno actually both A, patches up the window, and B, patches up Giorno, Misa, and Narancia the best he can with sticky fingers. But Bruno is visibly upset over the fact that Notorious B.I.G has actually taken out three of his members by itself, and quickly realizes that this is a very dangerous stand to actually be dealing with, and just hopes that it's gone. And but also points out that they'll need to go inform Baccio about what happened, and concludes that they'll need to get them inside Coco Jumbo to recuperate. At which point Trish actually stops Bruno, asking him if Gold Experience can just regrow everybody's limbs and everybody will be fine. But it's at this point, and this is the thing I was alluding to earlier, but it's at this point where Bruno actually reveals the main thing about close combat stands, is that as he puts it, both sticky, or at least this is the case for both Sticky Fingers and Gold Experience, but they need to physically make contact with something to activate their abilities. So the fact that Giorno is missing both of his hands means that he has repressed Gold Experience's ability to heal people. So for that reason, he concludes that that the only thing he can really do is administer first aid. And then tells Trish that Giorno likely isn't going to be helping them in their fight anymore. At which point he then leaves to go tell Baccio what happened, and this causes Trish to actually begin to contemplate some things. She then proceeds to point out, she then starts contemplating the fact about how she's currently thinking about how she could never really think about wrap her head around the gang's way of thinking, pointing out that she's mostly thinking of her own survival, and isn't really concerned about other people, or at least according to herself. Whereas everybody else has been doing what's right and has no real sense of self-preservation. They're doing what they can to protect everybody else as best they can. And Trish points out that she hopes that she'll be able to adopt those traits one day and become a better person. But she actually sits down in the seat and right behind the knife that nearly impaled her earlier. But when she notices a strange reflection in the knife and begins to start investigating, pointing out that she saw something over the edge of the plane that looked very ball shaped. And Trish has no idea what is actually going on. So fearing the worst, she actually winds up plucking the knife out of the back of the seat and proceeds in order to arm herself so that she can better defend herself, and tries to get a better look as to what exactly is on the outside of the plane. And what we do eventually find out is that Notorious B.I.G has actually somehow managed to cling to the plane and hasn't been thrown off like Giorno was hoping. And sure enough, Notorious B.I.G then proceeds to start attacking windows to try and get back onto the plane, which causes Trish to actually kind of freak out a little bit. And eventually does wind up finding the broken window, and in her panic, she actually winds up dropping the knife, which causes Notorious B.I.G to actually pluck it up and actually takes on its true form, I should mention. It actually develops features after this point, so which is why I've kind of been putting off picturing it. But yeah, after this point, it kind of takes on a very crude form with two little arms and a tail, and it's kind of cute, but also kind of terrifying considering what it can do. And Trish kind of starts panicking a little bit, wondering how it actually managed to get onto the plane. But then she recalls what Giorno said earlier and realizes that it most likely latched on to the fastest thing currently moving, which at this point was the plane when it fell off. So, of course, when it fell off the plane, it actually wound up attacking the plane instead and clinging onto it. And now that the plane is no longer the fastest moving thing, it then decided to try and get back onto the plane. But also remembering that it does indeed focus on movement, she realizes that all she has to do to get away from it is to be completely in control of her movements and back away slowly so that the stand doesn't go too quickly and try and chase her. But what she finds out with that approach is that the stand is very hypersensitive to any sort of movement, and even though she's moving very slowly, it does kind of cautiously reach out to her and try to touch her, but which causes her to kind of steal her nerves and hope the stand doesn't actually go and attack her. And of course, it does eventually break off its assault too, because its attention winds up being gathered by something else. And when Trish becomes very confused, pointing out that there shouldn't be anything else that it's going after in the immediate vicinity, until she discovers that Giorno's brooch is pulsing. And sure enough, upon closer inspection, she points out that it seems to have been imbued with Gold Experience life energy at the last minute, and is indeed growing fingers out of it, and is slowly taking the form of a crude left hand. And Trish, realizing that Giorno had grown himself an extra hand before cutting his hand off, realizes that Giorno had actually created a backup plan to kind of defend them against Notorious B.I.G, and ultimately concludes that if she's going to fight back against Notorious B.I.G and give the group a fighting chance, she's going to need to find a way to protect the brooch and get it back to Giorno so he can restore his hand and Gold Experience's healing properties. Although she herself admits at the very massive moment of the episode, she's not entirely sure how she's going to do that. So yeah, this episode is very interesting in that Notorious B.I.G is kind of one of the more interesting stands. Obviously, it breaks a lot of rules that are established for most stands. Obviously, we've seen all of these things manifest themselves in one way or another. Obviously, there's the fact that Tama eventually developed its own stand, which wound up being a plant cat hybrid, and yeah, that wound up being a stand, but it was indeed still a stand user. Notorious B.I.G is interesting in that not only does it not really have a stand user, but it also is a post-mortem stand, which aren't very common. There are maybe like 3 or 4 in the entire series, and Notorious B.I.G is one of them. So yeah, it's not a particularly interesting stand, and I'll get to that in the next episode, because there's a couple of things. There's an interview I kind of want to discuss a little bit, but yeah, this episode does kind of introduce Notorious B.I.G, and seems to be the start of Trish's kind of resolve to kind of finally become somebody and fight back. And we know she does eventually develop her stand, so I'm assuming that's going to happen either in this, possibly in the next episode, considering she now has to fight back against an enemy stand, and she doesn't really have the tools to fight back against that, so I can only assume she'll eventually figure out she has stand and be able to fight back. But that's mainly what this episode is. It just introduces the new threat, and I did mention that Carne kind of just shows up and dies. So yeah, he's not really relevant to the episode, but his stand is. So yeah, that's kind of sad a little bit. The fact that Carne shows up only to immediately die and lose the fight, and his stand then proceeds to just kind of get pulled into the ocean is just and the fact that his stand just kind of manifests itself and tries to try and fight it by on its own and it is doing a very effective job of the fact is it's kind of interesting that there's just a post-mortem stand that whereas the guy that was supposed to go and fight them wound up dying within like a minute of his introduction. So yeah, in any case, that's going to do it for my review of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. What did you guys think? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below or over on my Discord server, link in the description. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. Be sure to check out my Patreon in the description below as well. It's only a couple bucks a month. It really helps me out. And you guys get access to a bunch of cool perks that I'm always saying thanks. So be sure to check those out, and this link is down in the description. And finally, if you guys want to see more content from me, then be sure to check out the videos linked in the end screen. The top video is the most recent one. It may or may not be this one. Whereas the bottom video is a video recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me. So if you guys want to try something new or see more of what you like, then be sure to check both of those videos out. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching. As next time, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!